Hello and welcome to the 13th episode of our Trainz route building tutorial series. In this series I'm using TRS-19, but most things also apply to other Trainz versions. In this episode I'm covering the basics of Nav Points and also some other basic session rules. In this video I'm not going to use our usual tutorial Creek Railroad to demonstrate things, since session rules only really come into play once you've already got your route finished and you're starting to make sessions for it. So instead, I'm going to load the Milton Valley Railroad, which is the route that we've been working on live on stream. So I'm going to go to View Sessions with the Milton Valley Railroad selected, and I'm going to go to Create Session. A thing to note about the Milton Valley Railroad is that it is still in development and not finished yet. So don't be surprised by the lack of buildings in this town, for example. But the tracks themselves are perfectly functional, and we've got trackside objects in place like signals and junctions, so this should suffice for the purposes of this video. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to save the session. So I'm going to press Ctrl S, and then I'm going to create a new session. Now I'm going to give the session a name. Usually I number the sessions, so the first one would be 01, and then I usually type dash and then the name of the session. So for example, Fun Run. Now, if I click the check mark, this session has been saved. So if I go back to the main menu, you can see that Fun Run is now here. So I'm going to load this session again, and then I'm going to go over to the Layers panel, and I'm actually going to lock the route layer, and then make sure that the session layer is selected. The things you place on the session layer will be unique to this session and will not appear in any other sessions or in the route itself. Let's talk about Nav Points first. Nav Points guide the player through sessions. They appear to the player in the form of markers along the track. So for example, a nav point marker could indicate to the player that they should proceed along this track, or that they should stop on this marker, or that they should couple up to a specific car or wagon or decouple, or a whole lot of other things as well. So first let's think about what we want the player to do. So let's say that we want the player to start on this middle track and then continue along over here, then go to the station and load passengers here, then continue along over to here to this signal, then wait here for another train to pass, then continue over here and diverge onto the right track and carry along this way. So first things first, let's place down the player's train. Now that I've placed down the player's train, it's time to get started with the session rules. To access a session's session rules, you need to go up to the Edit menu and then click on Edit Session. At the top you can edit the session's name, below that you can set or edit the session's description, and below that, in the large window, you can see a list of different session rules that have already been put in place. But let's not worry about these at the moment. What we want to do now is add the nav points. To do this, click the Add button in the lower left corner, and then select the Navigation Display session rule. So I'm just going to scroll down here until I find it. Here it is. Then click the check mark to confirm, and you can see that the Navigation Display session rule has now been added. The order that these session rules are displayed in is actually important, because this is the order in which they are run. Usually, I keep most of my session rules at the bottom so that the initialization things like the driver setup or driver commands will run first. So to move a rule up or down, select it, and then click on the up or down arrows in the bottom right of this panel. Now let's add some actual nav points. Make sure the navigation display rule is selected and then click Edit. The first thing we need to set is the unique set ID. I'll type in set1. After that you can select a train. This means that only that train can trigger these nav points and complete this nav set. Without this being set, any train passing through a nav point will trigger it. Next is the navigation mode. This is in what order the points have to be completed, if any. I'm just going to leave this setting at the default, which is all points must be completed in sequence. Below that you can see that a nav point has already been added for us. The first thing we need to set here is a location. Nav points can be added either at track markers or on vehicles. So, since we want the player to stop by our station, we need to add a track mark there first. Usually my naming convention for track marks is to put in TM in the front to indicate that it is a track mark, and then I'll either give it a quick name or just a number. In this case I'll name it STN1 for Station 1. Also a thing of note here is that the layer is set as the session layer. This means that this track marker will only be placed within this session. So if you load the root or a different session, it won't be here. So I'll confirm this. As you can see, the track marker is set here. So now if I go back over to the navigation display session rule, you can see that when I press here to set the location, TM STN1 shows up here. And I'll just confirm here. Below the location is what icon is displayed. This is the icon that is displayed above that point along the track, which indicates to the player what they're supposed to do here. Default is proceed forward. If you click here, you can change this. For example, stop or turn around. These are all very useful. Since this is a passenger stop, I'm going to select passenger stop and then I'm going to confirm. The next field over is the display text. This is the text which is displayed underneath the actual navigation marker when you're driving. So I'm just going to type stop. Below that is the style. By default, this is set to automatic. This means that if any train, or the specific train you've set in the train section here, passes through this marker, it will automatically complete it and activate the next marker. If you click here, you can change this to manual. With this, you have to manually complete this navigation marker via session rules. If you click again, you can set it to require stop. Fairly self-explanatory. So now let's test this out. I'll confirm this, and then I'll quickly go into QuickDrive. As you can see over by our station, a navigation marker is now being displayed. It's displaying the correct icon, so the passenger stop icon, and it says stop underneath. Now let's just quickly test and see if this works. First, however, I need to set the junctions. Now let's continue. So now, as you can see, I need to stop for the marker to be completed. I've noted two things we need to change. The first is that the junctions should be set correctly when we begin. The second is that we need to move the marker a bit further down the track, because at the moment only the first coach is partially on the platform. If you want junctions to be set to some setting as a default in one session, then you can simply switch the junctions in the surveyor and this information will only be saved in the session. So if I switch these junctions like this, for example, and then I save the session, and then I load the route itself, you can see that the junctions are still set the way they were set before. Now I'll load our session again. The second thing we wanted to do is to move our marker back a bit. So all we need to do is move our track mark back a bit. So let's put it around here, for example. Yes, I do realize that this will block the crossing, but I'm willing to accept that. Next, let's put in a proceed marker indicating that the player will turn off here. So I'll just quickly put down the marker over here, give it a name, so for example TM2, and then we'll add it to the nav display. So I'm going to go back to the session rules, click on navigation display, click edit, and then I'm going to click the plus symbol on the side here. This adds another navigation point below that navigation point. I'm going to set the location to the track marker we've just added, so TM2, then I'm going to click confirm, and I'm going to change the icon to proceed right. And for this I'm just going to leave the text empty, and I'm going to leave it at automatic. Now I'll confirm this and go back, and let's just add one final track marker at the end of the track over here. Let's make this a stop marker. So I'll add another marker, give it a name, so for example TM stop, and then I'm going to add that as well. Here I'm going to choose the stop icon, and I'm going to display the text stop. I'm also going to change the style to required stop. Then I'm going to confirm this and confirm this. Now let's test this. The first thing we'll notice is that the junctions are set correctly. So now if I continue over to the station, you can see that as I approach, the next marker is also being displayed, only with a bit more transparency. So the marker is over there where I set the track mark to be. The marker has now been completed, and so the next one is now completely opaque. As you can see, the stop marker is now being displayed with a bit of transparency since we're approaching the previous marker. Now we've completed all navigation markers, but the session hasn't ended yet. So let's go back into the session rules and make it so that the session ends when we've completed all navigation markers. For this tutorial, I'm not going to go into ranked sessions, as that is a whole nother thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to end the session. So let's go back to the surveyor and add this. So I'm going to go back to the session rules, and I'm going to add another session rule. So we could do this one of two ways. We could either check if the last point in this navigation set is completed, or if the entire navigation set is completed. If you want to check if the entire navigation set is completed, you would need to use the navigation set check rule. If you want to check whether a specific navigation point is completed, you would not need to use the navigation point complete rule, as this sets a navigation point to be complete, but rather you would need to use the wait on navigation point rule. So let's use this one. I'll click confirm, and then I'm going to edit this rule. First we have to set the index of the navigation point we are checking for. So let's just quickly look up which one we want. So let's go back to our navigation display, and you can see that the last one has index 3. So I'm going to go back over to the rule we've just added and set this to be 3. Next, it's asking for the set of navigation rules. We've set the navigation rule to 1, so I'm just going to add 1 here. Then if we confirm this, you can see that this is no longer throwing an error. Now, we want a specific session rule or set of session rules to run only if this session rule returns true. So first I'm going to add the session rule we want. The one I'm going to use is end session. When this is triggered, the session ends. So I'll add this. And the way it's set up currently, this will run at the same level as all the other session rules, so it will end the session as soon as we enter. To make this session rule only trigger when this one gets triggered, we need to select the end session rule and click the right arrow in the bottom right of the panel. As you can see, the end session rule is now indented, which means it will wait for this one to be true. Now let's quickly try this out. Now, when I stop on this marker, it should end the session and return me to the menu. And as you can see, I'm back in the menu. That covers the basics of navigation points. I'm going to cover how to manually trigger navigation points in the next video, because I'm going to tie that into the basics of how AI trains work and how to give drive commands. But for this video, I'm just quickly going to cover the default session rules that are added whenever you create a new session. So let's start with driver setup. If you select this and click edit, you can see a list of drivers here. For a train to be able to be driven by either the player or an AI, it needs to have a driver. If you click here, you can change it to only be an AI driver, or to be the first human player. With this, you can set which train the player is focused on at the beginning of a session, and the last one is multiplayer driver. Below that, in this black area, you can add driver commands. So if you click on the little arrow here, you can set a driver command. We'll get to those a bit later, and we'll cover some of these in the next video. Next is the driver command rule. If we edit this, you can see a list of all driver commands that are currently installed in Trainz. These are things that you can tell AI trains to do, for example, to instantly load the train, or to unload the train, or to turn a turntable, or to do all sorts of different things. By default, only some of these are checked. This will impact which driver commands are available to give to Trainz. You can enable or disable these commands here. Next is the cleanup derailed trains rule. If you edit this, all you can do is select a time which needs to elapse since a train's derailment for it to be removed. After that is the quick drive rule. So if we edit this, you can see that these are essentially the settings for the session. Up here, you've got which time of day to start at and what the time rate is supposed to be. Next is a toggle, which is Enable Gameplay Session Mode. By default, this is disabled, which means that the player can change any of these settings when they load the session in driver. Next is Enable In-Game Help by default. With this enabled, junctions are always displayed in driver. If you disable this, then you have to move the mouse pointer over junctions for them to display which direction they're set. Below that, you can set the control method to either easy mode, in which you can just set the speed of the train and it will always keep that speed, or to realistic mode. I mostly use realistic mode, but it largely depends on your route and session. Next, you can set whether realistic mode requires you to have achievements. I've never used this one, and I really can't imagine anyone using this, but it's here. The next one is the derailment setting. So with none selected, trains will not derail by going too fast around curves. They will, however, still derail if they run off of the tracks. Lastly, you can set the units of measurement used, either to imperial, metric, or the route default. Next is the consist data handler rule. This doesn't have any settings by itself, but it does enable players to put down consists when they're playing via the quick drive rule, if that is enabled. Lastly, we have the Interlocking Tower Path Selection user interface, and I won't go into this, because this is connected to interlocking towers and block sections, which is a lot more complicated and beyond the scope of this video. Next time we'll continue with track marks and get into how to manually set them, but mostly we'll get into AI trains and giving commands to them. So for now, thank you for watching this video, and I hope it was helpful.